It all begins with Jin, a boy who finds himself in an unknown mountain but doesn't know how he ended up there. Jin's life before the incident wasn't exactly a bed of roses because his elder sister, Haruka, would always try to guilt-trip him into doing her things for her. This was the reason why Jin didn't want to involve himself with her anymore, and by the time he had gotten his driver's license, Haruka turned him into her Uber driver by having him run errands to fit her convenience. One time, he drove her and her friends to the park for a fireworks festival, and she ditched him to do the heavy lifting. Right after she left with her friends, he heard a loud bang, and the next time he opened his eyes, he found himself in an unfamiliar forest. Surprised that he isn't in the parking lot, he checks around but doesn't see the car. Then, he checks his phone, but discovers the signal is out of range. With all the weird coincidences, Jin calms himself and chooses to walk down, believing he'll see the city, but when he gets to the end of the road, he sees a river, but then chooses to go further, and to his surprise, he sees the sea. Confused because he hadn't run into anyone despite walking for hours, Jin wonders what's going on, so he takes out the cooler, which was a part of the luggage he has with him, and digs into it to regain his strength. That's when he realizes that he hasn't seen any trash lying around the beach, and it makes him wonder if the forest is uninhabited. As the sun sets, he notes that he has to find a place to sleep, but recalling how far he was from where he came from, he gathers some twigs and with the help of the cutter he had brought along, he eventually makes a fire, before sleeping next to it, hoping that when he wakes up, he'll escape this nightmare. However, the following morning, he wakes up and sees he's still by the beach, and just before the fire burns out, he feeds it more wood. Later that day, he heads up and learns that he's on an island. Dejected, he cries for help, but then walks back while wondering how he ended up in such a dilemma. Still, he goes to get more wood for the fire, and on the way, he discovers the river source, noting how pure it is, and looks at it as the next source of water. After completing his task, he pounces on the last meal but suddenly hears a rustle in the bushes, and hopes it isn't a hungry bear. Luckily for him, he survives that night, so the next day, he catches some fish by the riverbank and eats them despite the lack of salt. By the fourth day, Jin has already completed his shed, so he digs up a path and makes an artificial bath. There, he notes that he's tired of grilled fish and crabs. As the days pass, Jin adapts to his new life thanks to his foreknowledge, and not too long after, snow piles up on the top of the mountain. So one time while scavenging for firewood, he spots some mushrooms and wonders if they are edible, but then leaves to start a fire at his hut. There, he notes that he'll have to try lots of fish soon because of the winter. While thinking about how he had survived the island till that moment, Jin isn't sure he can pull through the winter season. As he wonders if he'll die on the island, all alone, a ball of light suddenly flies into his hut and dances around him. It apologizes for getting Jin involved while trying to summon a hero. There, the light reveals that Jin is in a world he doesn't know. Realizing that he got involved in a mix-up, Jin demands that they return him, but the spirit tells him it's impossible. It tries explaining to Jin that one can only go in this world before they die, but then the spirit realizes that he can still sense Jin's lifespan on Earth. Confused, Jin asks where he is, and he gets briefed that he's in a world with magic and swords. Since the story sounded like a comic, Jin finds it hard to believe, but then he learns that the spirit before him used to be a god, but had lost its powers when it summoned the hero. The spirit tried explaining the process to Jin, but it was as hard as teaching a monkey calculus. Among all the things the spirit said, Jin grasped that it could only summon 3 people before they died, but Jin was pulled in along with Haruka and the rest. Upon hearing his sister being mentioned, Jin realizes that she's the hero, but then finds it hard to believe that he was supposed to die. Suddenly, a group of people appears right before him, and when the spirit sees Van, it realizes it's in trouble, but Van says they'll talk later. Right now, they all prioritize what Jin will wish for. Among them was Richie, a weak dog whom the spirit had claimed was the one who failed during the summoning process, but then Van glares at it and insists they'll settle it later. They then tell Jin he can't return to his world, so he should pick a guardian deity. The rule is that the summoned person is given protection, and the remaining lifespan they've had in their previous world would be bestowed upon them as skills or items they'd need in this current world. Van lists a lot of skills before introducing himself as a being whose power is the fire attribute. Rudiel is in charge of earth and stillness magic, Kadal also rules over the flowers and order, and Ish oversees water and healing. The old lady among them rules the land and harvest, then the cutie named Mashido controls light, wind, as well as romance and caprice. The last human to introduce herself tells him she oversees light, love, and beauty, then she points to Rish and informs Jin that Rish oversees ice and darkness but has lost most of its powers. Jean notices that their powers overlap, and Van explains that people vanish when they are born in this world, and Michio reveals that there are other powerful people like them, but it's rare to be a god because becoming one means one's power is of such a high caliber, and people treat them that way. They then ask him which of their abilities he'd like, but Jin's greed gets ahead of him, so he requests all of them. Isekai'd then informs him that his lifespan on Earth is insufficient to receive all their powers, and if they try it, it will negate the divine protection given to him. Although there's an exception, it's not worth it since the deities don't stay together most of the time. Van then begins the hard talk, and Jean struggles to catch on with their logic, but Isekai'd just tells him to think about what he wants, and they'll bestow it upon him. With that, Jean requests that he gets to live comfortably without any desire or restrictions, and most importantly, not get involved with Haruka. Lastly, he asks for the ability to freely look around the world. There, Jean learns that Haruka has started acting in the current world, and she was bestowed the power of domination and all magic. Hearing this makes him shudder and wish not to be near her, no matter what. Isekai'd thinks about Jin's wish and then lists out tons of abilities that'll fill a PDF, before asking if Jean is okay with them. Among all of them, what catches his attention is the hero annihilation ability, and immediately, he accepts the powers. The deities hand him their blessings. First, he's given a sword that'll make Roronoa Zoro jealous, a blade that can cut almost anything. Van then hands him a powder that aids vegetation growth. The deities then thank him for not nagging at them for summoning him without his consent, but he surprises them by asking if he can take Richie along. Even though they tell him that Richius is almost blind and out of power, Jean agrees to take the mud along, and Ridiel grants him his abilities, saying they are compatible with him, before teleporting him into a safe house. When Jean opens his eyes, he realizes that he's been transported to a vast and beautiful land with a mansion. When he gets to the door, he sees that his hairdo was made to match the current world dwellers, so he heads in and is shocked by how spacious the place is. While exploring the building, he runs into a storage room and examines all the produce stored there, which has him wondering if he's in a dream. He sees two different types of fish swimming in a bucket and wonders if the water is connected to Japan. Just from staring at the fish, his tummy growls, so he makes up his mind to eat right after having his bath. He goes straight to his hot tub and relaxes, noting how long it's been since he had a proper bath. There, he has some shower thoughts, wondering if he can use the skill he received from the gods, so right after his bath, he uses the appraisal skill and learns that he needs to open the water gate so the water turbine underground can move. With that, he learns how to polish rice, so he tries it and cooks some for himself and Richie. He then promised to offer it meat as soon as it gets better. Right after, Jean cuts a slice of ham, chops cabbage, and prepares it to go with the rice. By the time the food is ready, he settles down to have the first proper meal in a while, and is amazed by the difference in taste with spices present. As he feasts, he notes that he survived the hardship. Later that night, he lies on his bed and notes that he doesn't need to worry about the fire going out anymore, nor would he be frightened of beasts coming, so he accepts the reality of living in the unknown world. Till daybreak, Jean struggles to fall asleep because it's been a while since he slept on a soft bed. Weeks pass, and Jean gets used to living in the house. After eating and securing a lot of rest for a while, he does his laundry and heads back inside to prepare a meal. When he gets to the storeroom, thanks to the appraisal skill, he can make basic dishes based on the main ingredients present. However, due to Jin's limited knowledge of food preparation, he hopes to try various cuisines that he can find in this world. He craves ramen, but then he doesn't have the required ingredients, so he switches to making rice and curry. While eating, Jean notes that he doesn't have a sack to store ground wheat, so he thinks about going to the shop with the money he received from the gods. After his meal, he picks up the world map and locates Canum, a place recommended to him to get items, so he immediately teleports there using his transition skill. Canum is a city close to the forest where monsters dwell, and naturally, adventurers tend to gather in places where monsters appear. Jean enters the city as an independent knight and says it's best he registers in the city's adventuring guild. But when he notices people staring at his new clothes, he buys a cloak so he doesn't stand out. He then goes shopping thanks to the money he received from the deities, and he guessed that Haruka probably received the same amount. He checks around town and purchases a lot of items ranging from utensils to farm tools, and from the shop owners, he learns where they sell armor and swords, so he goes there and purchases a random sword along with an expensive piece of armor. By evening, he settles at an inn, but then notes that he has to feed Riche and drops the things he bought, so he uses his transition skill to shift to his mansion. The next day, he visits the Adventurers Guild and registers by paying a fee rather than doing a commission without a reward. There, he reads a book that has the record of the demon forest and learns that the monsters there were animals that were possessed by evil spirits. The book also gives him information on the easiest places to go, topography, and how to defeat monsters. Suddenly, an adventurer named Dean shows up and confirms that Jean was the one who asked for an escort to study as an adventurer. Dean then reveals he's a 2-star silver, and Jean will end up being his last junior for him to guide. Jean wonders if it's okay for Dean to instruct him alone, and he nearly reveals his real name, but then introduces himself as Jean. Suddenly, Dean's sister, Emile, comes along and complains that Dean randomly accepts newbies to guide rather than nobles. Jean feels he's interfering, but Dean turns to Emile and tells her that Chris, another instructor, can handle the nobles, but then she doesn't want Chris as the only hotshot around, so she pleads with Jean to cooperate with her. Once Kana learns of it, she scolds Emile and tells Dean that although he has the right to refuse to educate his juniors, he must, however, pick from the group of candidates the guild has brought up. Kana then apologizes to Jean for the siblings' behavior, and as he could sense the familiarity between them, just like with Haruka, Jean withdraws his request. Immediately Emile hears him, she's overjoyed, so she tells him to call a different party that looks promising, but he walks past her like she's a ghost and tells Kana that he doesn't want any escort anymore. She apologizes for the inconvenience and promises to return the charges for the request. Instead, he asks her if he can take the manual with him, and she agrees, so he leaves the guild and heads straight to the forest entrance. On the way, he notes that every sister is a landmine, and he won't endure being in that kind of connection again. Suddenly, Mishido appears and asks him if he isn't going to use the separation skill. Scared in his boots, Jean nearly passes out, but she shushes him before informing him that he's the only one who can currently see and hear her. Also, the best way to talk to him is through his thoughts, and she can only hear the words directed at her. He is instantly relieved once he learns that she can't just read his thoughts indiscriminately. Still on the separation skill topic, Jean tells Mishido that the skill seems like something with a permanent effect, but he won't hesitate to use it on Haruka. Mishido then informs him that he can use the skill whenever he wants, but expanding the target of the skill weakens its effect. Also, if he uses it on someone, then the people around the target will stop talking about him. Once she teaches him how it works, he thanks her, and she vanishes into thin air. After she leaves, he wonders if Mishido took an interest in him because he hadn't used the skill, or maybe she wanted to advise him, but rather than ponder on it for long, Jean settles for both as the answers. He arrives at the gate and, on getting to the forest's entrance, he reads the manual and learns that a rabbit monster will appear nearby, and the ones he's to watch out for are the horned ones because they are stronger than the others. Since there's no escort with Jean, he summons his Hero Annihilator blade from his storage skill, and not long after, a rabbit with a tiny horn tries to attack him, so he swings his blade to swat it away, but he dices the creature like a hot knife through butter. He then wonders what would happen if he used the regular sword he bought from the shop, and to his surprise, he gets the same result. He then takes a look around the forest and spots a beautiful grass, and thanks to his appraisal skill, he learns it's medicinal, so he keeps it in his storage. He sees some fruits and is happy that the forest is more fun and abundant than the island, so he takes them, but not too far away. He spots the same type of mushrooms he saw in the mountains, and with his appraisal skill, he learns they are edible. Jean suddenly senses a strong presence nearby, and he flinches as if spotting a ghost. He notes the creature he's sending is far stronger than the rabbits, so he turns around and is shocked to see a horned bear, preparing to attack him. And with a swing of his sword, the horned bear drops to the ground, and Jean is shocked by how powerful the sword is. Mishido appears suddenly and asks him if he won't use magic, and Jean, who nearly suffers from a heart attack, warns her not to startle him next time. Jean then realizes that he hadn't thought of using magic and even wonders if there's a point in using it at such a low level, but then he tells Mishido that he wants to try it out. He tries looking for a monster, but Mishido tells him there's no need to walk around, and all he has to do is use the search skill. There, Jean remembers he had such a skill and then tries it, and to his surprise, his vision zooms in like a Samsung camera on a horned rabbit, and he realizes how much easier things would have been if he had utilized the skill from the beginning. Mishido then tells him to imagine the kind of magic he wants to use, then he should draw out the attributes he needs. She reminds him of each of the deity's attributes and informs him that he possesses all of them. Suddenly, the horned rabbit leaps at him, so he imagines the wind attribute and then uses the magic to slash at the bunny, unaliving it in a single shot. Jean is impressed that the attack worked, and he thanks Mishido for her help. As she flies off, she tells him that other spirits will lend him their power once he gets to know them. Also, he should use magic with care since there are only a few people who can use it. After she leaves, Jean wonders how he'll transport the dead bear to the guild, but shortly afterwards, he walks casually with a poker face straight to a trade guild while carrying the bear in his backpack. Shocked, the shop owner wonders where Jin's strength is coming from, and when Jean looks inside the shop, he sees a lot of dismembered animals, and thanks his stars for the mental fortitude's passive skill he has. If not, he couldn't stand the sight. The shop owner then examines the bear and sees its high quality, so he asks Jean if he's sure he wants to sell it to him. After all, he can get it for a higher price at the Adventurers Guild. Jean confirms his choice, noting that he doesn't want to run into Dean and Emil's tantrums, and the shop owner tells him to give him 15 minutes to appraise the carcasses. Jean curiously asks for a place to learn potions, and the man tells him that the headquarters next door are in charge of that, so Jean tells him he'll be going there. Upon getting there, he reads through a lot of potion recipes and realizes they are easy to make. Jean is interested in this field even though he doesn't need potions to heal himself, thanks to the blessings he got from the deities, but because he doesn't want to stand out, he makes up his mind to get some tools on his way back home. The shop owner then meets Jean at the potion headquarters and shows him a magic stone he found in the bear. Jean remembers reading up on it in the guidebook, and he's surprised at how small the stone is. But the shop owner calls it a red spinel, saying that the redder it is, the more expensive. He then congratulates Jean and informs him that it can be used by someone strong in fire magic. To his surprise, Jean tells him to trade it. After all, he can already use magic. Now that he's done with business, he takes a stroll around the city and ends up at a shopping district where bread is sold. So he decides to try this world's food for the first time, and he gobbles the glizzies but notices how greasy they are. He then tries some dried fruits, and the sour taste has him craving sugar. Then, he notices a stall selling brown sugar in clumps, which are measured on a scale. When he gets close to her, he sees she's selling alcohol, and then he wonders what the drinking age is in the current world. Suddenly, he spots a group of people gathering around a shop, so he goes there and sees they're watching a stall on a roast pork, so he joins in and learns they sell pork slices with bread. Without wasting time, Jean digs into it and savors the taste, and as he leaves, he makes up his mind to get a pig later. Later that night, when he gets home, he talks about wishing to eat more, but he hasn't regained his appetite from the mountain trauma. As he briefs Riche about how his day went, he sees the dog whining, so he applies healing magic on it, seeing that Riche's existence is getting fainter. Even though he knows the dog isn't sick and the magic doesn't work on it, Jean still makes it his routine, and he hopes Riche gets better soon. After that, he goes to bed, and the next day, while eating, Jean notes that he'd like to use his language skill, so he makes up his mind to go to the royal capital to read the books from this world. When he gets there, he speaks to the city guards and informs them that it's his first time at the capital and would need a map and a guide to tour the place. The guard then hands him a map and tells him to ask the brats hanging out in the city square, and if he pays any of them a few, they'll show him around. When the guard honestly tells Jean that it's a 50 to 50% chance of him being tortured right, Jean hands him some coins and thanks him for his help. Impressed by Jin's generosity, the guard recommends Jean meet with Leon, a blue-haired boy sitting by the well in the city square, and Leon will guide him. Once Jean gets inside, he notes that the structures are smaller than he thought, and the buildings are connected. He navigates his way to the square and sees Leon by the well, so he walks to him and asks to confirm, but he gets a stern stare from the boy. Jean immediately informs Leon that he heard Leon was touring people around the city. Leon's delinquent face scares Jean, and he wonders if he got tricked, so he apologizes, but Leon tells him he's right and offers to guide Jean around. Judging by Leon's reaction, Jean concludes he's a nice person despite his looks, so he asks Leon for the must-see spots in the city, and Leon says it's the view from the top of a stronghold, but then he reveals that civilians cannot enter the place. Jean gets confused and nearly asks if Leon has a few screws loose for bringing it up, but then he asks for other recommendations, like a clothing store or an eatery. He glares daggers at Jean before suggesting they eat quickly and offering to take Jean to his friend's clothing store. With that, Jean follows Leon around and curiously asks why the house walls stick close to each other, and Leon explains that not only does the capital have limited land spaces, but people build houses that weigh to half the taxes they are required to pay. He lists out the types of taxes the civilians pay, and when Jean hears of glass taxes, he realizes that he hasn't seen glass windows in the royal capital, nor at Canum. Jean then asks Leon about the large building that stood out from the other buildings in the square, and Leon calls it the Bough of Spirits. He informs Jean about how plants are grown beautifully in the inner courtyard, where there's clean water running at all times. Leon then stops as he realizes he should have shown Jean the place first, but Jean tells him not to mind and promises to visit the place on his way back home. Suddenly, Note shows up looking for Leora and calls Leon young miss, causing Jean to struggle processing what's going on. Leon then introduces Note as Alderhade's butler, and as she asks Note why he showed up, Lilith, who spots Leon, reveals that someone is after her. She tells Leon to get out of the city, and a wagon has been arranged for her. Adamant, Leon says there's no reason for her to leave, but as Note tries to explain what's going on, Lilith skips to the chase by grabbing Leon and striking her in her gut. Unfortunately, Lilith realizes too late that Leon was already injured before the punch, so she demands a potion from Note, but he says Leon doesn't have access to it since she's been kicked out of the Alderhade family. She signals to some men, and they have the carriage over. Jean, who cannot process what's going on, offers Lilith a potion for her to use to treat Leon, but when she hears that Jean was Leon's tour guest, who is heading to Thane's shop, Lilith ropes him in with them, and they head towards the clothes store. Note then gives Leon the potion, and Jean prays it works, since he hasn't tried it on himself, but Lilith thanks him for his help. Leon wakes up shortly after and learns that her brother was uneasy with her still alive, so he made a charge against her. Realizing it's another sibling feud, Jean makes up his mind not to interfere, but he can't help wondering why Leon was injured and chose to show him around the town. Worst of all was the fact that Leon is a lady. They arrive shortly at Thane's clothes store, and Leon asks him to procure clothes for Jean. She then apologizes to Jean because she can't continue his tour, but he waves it off and tells her to hurry back into the carriage. Lilith, on the other hand, thanks Jean and introduces herself before handing him a ring and saying he should look for her if he encounters any problems, although it'd be best if he doesn't do that for the time being, since she won't be around for a while. Jean takes the ring and then asks who Leon is, so Lilith reveals Leon's real name as Leora, but because Leora isn't prosperous in the melons department and she's tougher than most boys, many people concluded she was a male, hence coining the name Leon. With that, they take their leave, and Thame attends to Jean and pleads that he keep everything that he witnessed a secret. Jean doesn't see any clothes he can select, but before long, Thame's workers take his measurements, and they sew him some clothes. A few hours later, Jean buys some bed covers, so he goes to a corner where he can't be seen and hides them in his storage, and it's thanks to his exploration skill that he gets to find unpopular places in the city. He sets his next goal to visit a bookstore, but then decides to eat first, so he gets some food before grabbing some books and heading home. Later that evening, he tries reading a book under the dim candlelight, then he thinks about making a lamp, but then he recalls Mashido's advice, so he imagines the light attribute, and immediately, a ball of light appears. Jean is overjoyed, and as he recalls the day's events, he thinks about Leora, the weird, good lady, and prays for her safety. At that moment, Riche opens his eyes. After acquiring everything he needs from the forest, Jean turns to Riche and calmly says they're heading back. As they make their way home, he reflects on how recently Riche had been unconscious and how relieved he feels now that he has fully recovered. Back at the house, Jean carefully stores his new harvest and thinks about how he learned raising livestock, making cheese, and even helping out with carpentry. Due to the lingering smell of medicinal herbs, Jean plans to build more dispensary sheds before winter and decides to gather building materials. Shortly after, he notices the cork oak seedling he bought earlier and steps outside to plant it, adding a growth powder for quicker growth. To his shock, the seedling suddenly grows into a tree right in front of him, and he recognizes the amazing power of the powder. Examining the trunk, he realizes the wood would make excellent raw material. He then decides to go shopping in Canum and deliver the game left in his storage. When he arrives in Canum, Jean finds himself reconsidering his routine of constantly renting rooms just to deliver goods and wonders if it's better to rent a house in the town. As he walks through the street, he spots a handkerchief lying on the ground. Looking around, he notices Emile standing nearby and realizes that she has been stalking him ever since he unloaded a bear and potions at the trade guild. Jean ignores all her attempts to get close to him like she's a leech, then he decides to rent a house. Before long, a realtor shows him a new building that is cheap and safe. While inspecting it, Jean realizes that old houses are better since previous homeowners would have made the improvements. Since he has the transition ability, Jean decides to help out to obtain knowledge. He informs the realtor about his intention to purchase the house and goes around town, assisting in carpentry, cheesemaking, and plasterwork while Emile stalks him. Later that day, Emile tries to gain Jin's attention and start a conversation, but he ignores her completely. She asks whether he plans to enter the demon forest and warns him that it becomes especially dangerous during colder seasons. He thanks her politely but assures her he has considered the risks. She begs him not to go since it's not safe, but he ignores her till she trips. In reality, this was a move she had tried, hoping to tug at his heartstrings and rush to her, but man ain't no simp, so he ditches her and exits the town's gate, where he sees Dean. Surprised by the coincidence, Jean excuses himself as he walks past Dean. However, Dean immediately recognizes Jean and urgently asks him to show up at the Adventurers Guild. He explains that the higher-ups are scolding Kana for losing a promising adventurer to the trade guild. Dean admits that he and Emile are actually responsible and apologizes sincerely. After thinking briefly, Jean decides to drop by the Adventurers Guild with the sole condition that Dean prevents his sister from approaching him anywhere. Stunned, Dean wonders if it's okay since his sister is cute, but Jean claims she is creepy. Hearing that Emile isn't Jin's type, Dean wonders what his type is. Jean thinks about the complete opposite of Emile as his type, and Leora unexpectedly comes to mind. Before he can dwell on that thought, Dean interrupts and offers to show him a location where rare plants grow as a form of apology. Jean accepts, and they head out together. At the site, Jean examines various herbs and notices the kinka herb, commonly used to add fragrance to alcohol, favored by wealthy nobles. After discussing its value, Dean suggests catching a rabbit for lunch. Jean agrees since he can't openly use his abilities. Moments later, Dean cooks the meat, and Jean acknowledges his hunting skill, claiming that it was educational. However, Dean claims it's embarrassing because he can hunt bears, but Jean casually responds that he relies mostly on brute force. Dean glances at Jin's slim frame and wonders where that brute force comes from. Suddenly, Dean stiffens and reaches for his weapon after sensing strange movements. Out of nowhere, Leora appears, startling both of them. She apologizes, and Jean asks why she's there. She reveals her intention to hunt bears, but Jean quickly considers how to manage this situation, since Dean does not know her true identity. Dean asks if they know each other, and Jean affirms it. Leora introduces herself to Dean with her alias and then apologizes to Jean, claiming she will pay him back for the potion he gave her. However, Jean claims she's not indebted to him since she showed him around the town. Thereafter, Dean offers her some food, and the trio sits together to eat. Seeing that Leora can hunt bears, Dean asks why she is broke, and she tells them about the expensive in fees. She describes the substandard room she's paying a gold coin for daily and the receptionist who introduced her to it. From the description, Dean and Jean immediately realize that Emile is involved with those reaping her off. Dean quickly vouches for Emile and faults the inn, but Jean talks about his weird sister complex. With that, Dean panics as Leora's face displays hostility, but she reveals that there's a spirit beside his sister. She also talks about the mark of that spirit's influence floating around Dean's head. Jean wonders what she's talking about, but Dean says he can't see it, claiming that it's weird to see a mark. Suddenly, Jean sees the cute petal on Dean's head and struggles to hold back his laughter after seeing Dean's poker face. He wonders if it's an artificial flower and excuses himself before pulling it off. Instantly, Dean collapses unconscious, and Leora explains what happens when the domination effect is suddenly severed. She then asks if he can see and touch spirits. Jean confirms it and thinks about Riche and the other spirits called gods that show themselves whenever they want. With that, Leora reveals that he is the only person other than her father with such an ability. Jean asks about her bloodline, and she claims that only she and her dad can see spirits, but they can't touch them. She advises Jean to be cautious because people will covet his ability. Half-jokingly, Jean suggests silencing Dean permanently and asks if Leora is fine with Dean knowing her ability. Leora firmly states that she does not want Dean harmed, especially if he is Jin's friend. When Jean casually mentions that this is only his second meeting with Dean, Leora immediately suggests leaving him unconscious for a bear to devour. Seeing that she has the same train of thought as him, her sudden resignation to fate shocks him, and he realizes that she's someone who gets the short end of the stick. Following that, Leora asks if he can see the spirit following her, and Jean suddenly notices the little bird pecking her head aggressively. Seeing it clearly, he is left completely speechless. The little bird continues pecking at Leora's head without pause, but she ignores it completely. Jean asks if it hurts, and she briefs him about the dull but unbearable pain she is feeling. Thinking deeply, Jean wonders how the incessant pecks only cause dull pain, but he suddenly notices the band of light around the bird's neck, which seems like a collar. Upon appraisal, Jean discovers that the bird's name is Rue, and it is a captured spirit. To his shock, Rue was sent by Alderhade Rulatentine to make Leora look more manly. Moments later, Leora reveals that the spirit was attached to her by her father since she was 7 years old, but Jean wonders how she put up with the dull pain for so long and is curious about her father's reason for doing so. Leora then claims that her father wants her to become an outstanding successor, but Jean wonders why, while pointing out that she has a younger brother. At that moment, Leora explains how the spirits were sent to her based on the rumor that her father did so after getting drunk and waking up next to a woman. Leora goes on to explain that the country doesn't have issues with the successor's gender as long as they are the firstborn. However, her family has served in the military for several generations, and her father did it, so there won't be gender differences when she trains there. Jean then talks about the downside of doing so since strength and stamina matter, but he notes that it is weird for her to be more manly. He apologizes for involving himself in her family's matters and suggests that she release the bird spirit that is desperately pecking her. Leora reveals that it should have been released 2 years ago, but her father collapsed before he could undo it. She asks if he is capable of doing it, and he affirms with uncertainty. Jean then suggests releasing it after they return to town. Leora decides to leave it to him and intends to reward him no matter the outcome, but Jean reminds her that she is broke. He asks about her lodging, and after she claims she will hunt bears, Jean recalls that it's why she came there in the first place. Later that day, Dean wakes up and apologizes on his sister's behalf, but Leora says he was influenced by an evil spirit. She discloses that many of the guild's men had the mark, and someone even had a petal on his head. With that, she guesses why Dean had more petals and concludes that it is because he spent the most time with Emil. Jean imagines the scene of men with flowers blooming on their heads and quietly rejects the absurdity. Shortly after, Dean also apologizes to Jean, but he overlooks it because there was no real damage to him. Seeing how dire the situation is, Dean decides to discuss it with Kana before taking Emil to the Bower of Spirits. While thinking about the Bower of Spirits, Jean recalls that Leora was meant to take him there when they met, and he wonders if there is one in Canum. Since he doesn't know a lot about it, Jean decides to stay quiet. After listening to their conversation, Jean discovers that every city has its own Bower of Spirits, but they differ in design. Presumably, it is a place to approach spirits and also cast them out. Soon after, Dean apologizes and tells them about his intention to return to town to initiate his plans. Since they are hunting bears, Dean suggests that they use a conveyor, and he hands Jean a piece of paper containing the details of the conveyor he requested. He offers it to them, and Jean thanks him. Following that, Dean declares he will keep his lips sealed and not reveal their abilities to see and even touch spirits. As they part ways, Jean confirms internally that Dean had already suspected his unusual ability to touch the mark of spirits. Moments later, Jean and Leora work together to defeat some wolves. Afterwards, Leora praises Jin's skills, but he also thinks she's incredible. Jean thinks about Leora's amazing sword skill, which he mimicked with his martial art ability, and praises its serenity. Shortly after, the conveyors exclaim because of the sheer number of wolf corpses, and they ask Jean and Leora to carry the remaining since their rented carriages are fully loaded. Unable to hunt bears, Leora notes that wolves cost less, but having that many should be enough. She then apologizes for troubling him, but Jean brushes her worries aside and asks where she wants to try the spirit's release. Leora suggests an inn since she might black out longer than Dean, but Jean warns that it might be for days. Jean asks about her butler, and Leora claims they are supposed to rendezvous at Canum, but she does not know when he will arrive. Hearing this, Jean realizes she was ripped off because of the butler's absence, and then suggests using his house. Moments later, they arrive at Jin's house, and Jean welcomes her to his abode. She commends his good taste, and he is glad he had repaired the rental house, else it'd look like a knockoff storehouse. After confirming his weird smell, Jean decides to have a warm bath and also offers Leora. She accepts, and he leaves to prepare the necessities. While drawing water, Jean thinks about bathhouses that have steam baths and bathtubs. Since the appraisal isn't offering much help due to sanctuary conditions, he decides to use the laundry washtub instead. After completing the preparations, he gives all the necessities to Leora and explains where the toilet is. She thanks him, and he leaves. Thinking deeply, Jean plans to use the free time to change his clothes with the transition ability and also prepare a guest bed. Later that day, Leora allows Jean to do his thing, and he studies the spirit pecking her head. He wonders if the collar of light is related to it and effortlessly snaps it. Leora feels a jolt of pain and collapses. Disappointed that her fall wasn't cushioned due to her lack of milk factories, Jean tucks her in bed and warns Rue not to seek revenge. Jean is thankful that it was easy, but now worries about how long she will remain unconscious. While waiting, he decides to furnish the third floor. Time passes, yet Leora is still unconscious. Jean apologizes to Riche for the lack of attention. As he reflects on Leora's situation, Mishido, Rudiel, and Pal suddenly appear, requesting the names of the spirits that fled from there. Mishido then reveals how Jin's sister has been recklessly using her large amount of magic even though she can't see spirits. Since she has an obsessive but fickle nature, Jean guesses she will do something rash that year. Mishido further explains how lots of small spirits have been used up, and tells him Namina's warning. At that moment, Jean realizes that the ball of light has a name. Worried, Mishido guesses his sister will dominate the spirits once Namina's power fully returns and she starts seeing them. Rudiel apologizes for involving him against his wish, but claims that the spirits are noisy, and Jean recalls that Rudiel's dominion is stillness. Pal also gives her view on the impact of the current situation on the hero's development. Seeing that Jean does not understand the impact, Mishido asks him to look outside the window and see for himself. Just then, Jean panics as soon as he sees the large number of spirits sticking to his window. Mishido narrates how his sister's dominate skill affects the spirits just by being near her and how these spirits gather around him because of his liberation skill. After Jean asks what to do, Pal advises him to name them, and they will freely scatter without being subject to anyone's dominate ability. Mishido and Rudiel also stress the importance of a strong connection between him and the spirits. However, Jean complains about their sheer number, but Rudiel still asks him to go ahead and later change names if any of the spirits do not like it. In addition, Pal claims he can thoughtlessly name them because the spirits can be renamed by people they like in the future. Jean thinks about the contradictions in the order of people the spirits like, but Rudiel advises him to give them numerical names since the spirits will lend him their powers. After Jean accepts, Mishido leads him outside to give the spirits names, but he wonders if he can continually live a pleasant life once his sister starts seeing spirits. 2 hours later, Jean takes a break and goes to check on Leora. Using the transition skill, he teleports inside the house, but surprisingly, Mishido tags along. While she asks about Leora, the bird spirit perches on Jin's shoulder, and he shows the unconscious Leora to her. He then explains Leora's situation to Mishido, who considers it a maiden crisis. Considering Mishido's words, Jean wonders if she clearly sees Leora as female and immediately argues that he does not have any scandalous intention. After performing a brief blessing, Mishido explains what she meant and reveals that Leora won't have to use the bathroom till she wakes up. Jean apologizes for misunderstanding her, and Mishido brushes it aside while guessing that Leora will awaken the following night. She then asks about the bird spirit, and Jean tells her about Rue. Mishido reveals that Rue wants Jean to rename it, and he thinks deeply about it, noting that he sucks badly when it comes to naming. He eventually picks Azu, and Mishido confirms that the spirit likes it. Soon after, Jean asks Azu to watch over Leora since she might be sad if the little bird disappears. He then teleports back to continue naming the spirits, but Cadel and Ish arrive to praise his good work. Thereafter, Jean resumes the naming process. As soon as he finishes, Rudiel explains how they will seek his help once or twice a month whenever the spirits increase. Before Rudiel can stop Jean, he uses a light spell, which immediately summons a blinding light. Shocked, Jean swiftly covers his eyes, and Machido praises the improvement. After weakening the light, Rudiel asks Jean to open his eyes, and they explain how the spirits are lending him power. Just then, Jean recalls Machido's advice to use magic after some image training, but his stomach suddenly growls. Jean declares that it is dinner time and asks what they want to eat. However, the five of them make their demands, but Jean considers the list too unbalanced a diet. After preparing his meal, Jean gives them what they want and eats his own food. While thinking about the situation, he stares at Ish, who's eating a bowl of salt, and worries about his health. Shortly after, Jean asks if spirits can eat food, and Machido claims they can eat but can't taste. She further explains how non-humanoid spirits vary depending on their attributes. Afterwards, Riche demands some attention, but Jean tells him to wait since he is still eating. Rudiel glares at Riche, who is scheming since it used to be his master, and Machido claims it is cute while disclosing that they couldn't get close to Riche like him. However, she apologizes and says that they slightly trust him. Isekai'd then briefs Jean about Riche's past as a powerful deity, and Jean asks if it was an alpha. He explains the concept of an alpha who is considered a perfect leader in human logic before explaining further with a scenario. However, Isekai'd and Machido claim it is different for spirits. In addition, Isekai'd reveals that Riche could speak in the past and was highly intelligent. He advises Jean to take care, and after staring at the Riche's cuteness, Jean thanks them for their concern. Soon after, Machido calls Jean her honey, but he immediately understands what she meant, noting that she loves misleadingly phrasing her words. Thereafter, the humanoid spirits say their goodbyes before teleporting. On the other hand, Rudiel stares intensely at the supposed noble and solitary wolf before leaving. Before going to take a bath and sleep, Jean looks at Riche's cute antics and claims it'll be a surprise if he later discovers that it's an act. The following day, Jean goes to the pottery town to order a bathtub, and after seeing some nice tableware, he suggests getting some later. Upon reaching the pottery workshop, Malcolm introduces himself, and Jean hands him the paper containing his idea for a bathtub. Malcolm looks through and reveals that he recently received an inquiry about a bathtub from the neighboring town. At that moment, Jean concludes that it is his sister and her crew. Malcolm appreciates the blueprint and begs Jean for the opportunity to develop it. After accepting Malcolm's offer, Jean leaves and thinks about the weird involvement, even though his separation skill is blocking his information from reaching his sister's crew. Later in the evening, Leora opens her eyes, and Jean asks if she is okay. Surprised, she sits up and thanks him, but Jean asks if she is hurt. She complains about back pain, but he reveals that she was asleep for 3 days. Leora apologizes again for the inconvenience, but Jean brushes it aside and confesses that he renamed Azu while she was out. He tells her the new name, and she claims it is a good one. Leora claims an apology is not necessary since Azu likes him, but Jean notices she has a beautiful face without the usual wrinkled brows. He considers her looks as those of a beautiful young man and advises her not to get tricked into someone's bed. She reveals how Jean fares in that advice since she is already in his bed, but he claims he is safe. Since Leora hasn't eaten in days, Jean decides to prepare something for her, and he also accepts her request to stay over. Jean tells her to get better so she can get her rent money from the scammers, but Leora decides to also pay rent to Jean after. The next day, Jean and Leora meet the butler, Note, at the pub, and he is thankful that she is safe. Jean looks around and notices that only a few people have spirits following them, and no one has artificial flowers on their heads. Shortly after, Dean comes to meet Jean and decides to treat him to a meal as an apology. He notices Note and asks about him. Note introduces himself and explains his relationship with Leora. Just then, Jean notices a lizard spirit on Dean's shoulder and wonders if he is liked by spirits. While they eat, Dean narrates how Emile went to the Bower of Spirits to have her spirit cast out and how loads of people collapsed in the guild. Thereafter, he begs them not to spread the details so it does not affect Emile. Leora notes that spirit pranks are unintentional and can happen to anyone. She then claims that it was handled leniently because a close relative noticed it. Seeing the intelligent conversation between them, Jean realizes that Leora is warning him not to jeopardize their relationship with the people around them. Dean also promises to have Leora's money returned, and he discusses how he will help them find a 2-bedroom house to stay in. Jean ignores them and mans up drinking even though it's his first time. From nowhere, Dean asks Jean if he is interested in accompanying a mid-level adventurer once and promises to introduce him to the dude who fulfills requests. Jean accepts the offer, and Dean suggests that they meet the following day at the same time. While Emil stalks them, Dean advises Jean and Leora to be careful since they both have good looks, which will attract weird people. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. Subscribe and turn on your notification bell to not miss part 2.